Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amanda. I'm the Events and Marketing Director for Bookworks, your 35-year-old local independent bookstore in the North Rio Grande River Valley of Albuquerque. We're very pleased to be conducting some great virtual events right now during the COVID pandemic. You can get the full scoop at our website, which is bkwrks.com. You can also place orders there, and this week we are offering free shipping on all your orders. So when you're in the checkout line, just click on the coupon code and enter free ship, and you can have any books, any amount of books shipped to you anywhere in the country for free, including Larry Tye's new book, DEMAGOGUE, which we're here to speak about today. We're very pleased to have Larry with us. The book is getting rave reviews, perhaps in part because of our very charged political climate right now in the United States. Larry is the best-selling author of several books, including a biography of Bobby Kennedy, a biography called Satchel on Satchel Paige, a book called Superman, The Father of Spin, and a book written with Kitty Dukakis called Shock. He is an award-winning journalist. He's written for the Boston Globe, and he now works with health journalists to cover COVID and other health topics through the Health Coverage Fellowship. Perhaps he can speak more to us about that. Larry is here with us today with his new book, Demagogue, which is on Joseph McCarthy, one of the most dangerous demagogues in our American history, according to the copy for the book. We're pleased to have you here today, Larry. How are things going with you in Massachusetts?
Things are great here and a whole lot cooler, I think, than they are there in Albuquerque. And I'm not sure where people tune in from. But what I'd like to do is take a few minutes to tell you a few stories about Joe McCarthy. And I presume that anybody who would come to a session like this has some sense of who Joe McCarthy is. And I'd like to give you a little feel for some different things that I found out about McCarthy when I was doing research. It surprised me a bit about McCarthy, who he was, and why he is not just a story of ancient history, but a story of what's going on in today's America. And I'd like to tell you this first by saying what mine is probably the 25th biography of Joe McCarthy and the 100th or the 200th book written about him and his era. And so one thing any smart reader or listener to a book talk would want to know is, why the heck does the world need book number 201 or biography number 26? And the answer is, we might not have, but for two things. One thing was the election in 2016, which made clear, to me at least, that that this was a story of today. And the other is that I got access to some materials that biographers, the 25 biographers who came before me, had been hoping for but didn't get to see. And those included three things that I'm going to tell you about briefly. One was all of McCarthy's personal and professional papers. And these are things that his wife left to his alma mater, Marquette University, 60 years ago, not long after McCarthy died. And they are things that every biographer has asked the McCarthy family to have access to, and they've been either saying no or not saying anything for those 60 years. And I asked, and they said nothing to me for a long time, and I was convinced that I was never going to get to see these things. And then one day I got an email from the chief archivist at Marquette who said, "I'm as surprised as you are. The family has said yes." And they'd said yes in a very specific way. The yes was, yes, you can see them. And when you stop looking at them, they go back under lock and key. So it was, in a way, an author's dream that I got a chance to do it, and there was nobody queued up behind me because they're going to say no again. And why they said yes, you will conclude by the end of our talk tonight that it's not because I'm charming, and it may be because I was enough of a pest and asked often enough, and it may be because a woman named Greta Van Susteren, a relatively well-known TV journalist whose father was McCarthy's best friend, asked on my behalf as well, and she may have been the deciding factor, or it may have been some alignment of the stars and the moon or something else. Those papers were one important thing, and those had everything from McCarthy's wartime diaries to his love letters to basically every important piece of paper he had ever written or that was ever written about him. Thousands of small boxes of this material and material that made it clear that all the things that biographers had been waiting for all these years were worth waiting for and gave us a different take on who he was. The second set of material was McCarthy's medical and military records. And again, just after I told my wife and my publisher that we weren't going to get them, a week later, they turned up an enormous brown box at the head of my driveway with 1,000 pages of his medical records that showed he didn't die of what the coroner said he died of. All of his military records, which showed many things about his service in the Marines that were different than what he had said or what his critics had said about him. The last trove of papers, which may have been the best, were actually out there before I started writing my book, but nobody had really taken a deep dive into them. And they were 9,000 pages of transcripts of everything McCarthy had said at closed door hearings when nobody could watch him and nobody could hear him. And these again gave us a very different take on who Joe McCarthy was. When the doors were shut and when the journalists were shut out, we saw Joe McCarthy unhinged. And I want to take you, so we can come back and if you want to talk about any of those materials and talk about what I found there, but I want to take you to 3 different moments in Joe McCarthy's life that I think were touchstone moments and say a lot about who he is and about the new take we have on him. And the first moment was in 1950 on February 9th. And on February 9th, something substantial happens in every Republican Party meeting across America. It is the birthday of Abe Lincoln, the patron saint of Republicans, and parties all across the country use that birthday as a chance to raise money and to bring party members together and let them feel good about what they're doing. And if you're a substantial Republican politician in America, a big deal senator or the president or the vice president, you get invited to places like Boston and Washington, New York or San Francisco. If you're a backbencher like Joe McCarthy, who looks like you're going to serve one term and then be out of there, you get invited to places like where he was in 1950, which was Wheeling, West Virginia. He shows up at Wheeling that night at what his staff call Wheeling West by God, Virginia, which showed what they thought of where he was going. He shows up that night with a briefcase containing 2 speeches. One speech is a snoozer on national housing policy, which happened to be a topic he actually knew something about. And had he pulled that speech out of his briefcase that night, 70 years later, nobody would be talking about Joe McCarthy, and he would have been a one-term senator that people had easily forgotten. Instead, he pulls out of his briefcase the second speech, and that is a barn burner, and it's a speech where he waves around a sheaf of papers and says famously, "I have in my hand a list of 205 members of the Communist Party, and they are 205 people who are working in our State Department, who are undermining our security, and who President Harry Truman hasn't had the courage to identify and to kick out of the State Department." And it was an incredibly compelling speech. We know today that he may have had lots of different things in his hand that night, but he sure as heck didn't have a list of 205 spies at the State Department. But he was smarter than all the people who had come before, all the anti-communist red baiters who had come before and who had identified spies that they thought were in the government. And all those people who came before talked about traitors in our government. McCarthy went a step before. He counted the traitors and he named them, or he said he had the names of them. And that was very appealing to the public. It was a cowboy-like mentality, and it appealed to a very legitimate and real fear that Americans had in 1950. It was not long before that that we had seen exposed and tried and convicted the Rosenbergs, the famous atomic spies. It was not long before that that we had seen nationalist China become Red China. It was not long before that that we had seen spies all across the world be exposed, real 24-karat spies for the Soviet Union. And it was not long after that that school children would be taught that in the event of an atomic attack, they should do what was called duck and cover. They should put their hands over their head and get under their desk, and that was the way to respond to a nuclear attack. So the fear was real. The fact that the Soviet Union was a real enemy of the United States back then was very real. All that wasn't real was Joe McCarthy's naming of names and the sense that these people, if exposed, would truly give us some sense of security. But that didn't matter. Joe McCarthy had struck a nerve. Joe McCarthy, within 2 days, was on the front page of every newspaper in America and most major newspapers across the world. And Joe McCarthy was off and running. In the subsequent days, he did a trip to lots of small communities across America. And everywhere he went, he offered a different sense of what the threat was. The number went from 205 to 57 back to 205. And nobody is quite sure where any of those numbers came from. My theory on the 57 is that he stopped off on his way to Wheeling and had his famous hamburger or steak, and he used Heinz 57 sauce, and that was an appealing number to him. And there are all kinds of theories on where he came up with the numbers, but what we know is he had found his issue. He had gone from being a backbench senator to being a barn-burning, incredibly appealing candidate to Americans who were afraid and who were looking for somebody to blame. And Joe McCarthy's jihad or crusade had been launched. The sad thing in terms of people buying into this was that most of the 24-karat spies had been named and exposed and were long gone. And by the time Joe McCarthy joined the hunt, not only didn't he have names, but they were not this level of spy really left in the State Department or many other agencies of the federal government that McCarthy was pointing to. But that is moment number one in the career of Joe McCarthy, February 1950, where he really gets things going and launches this crusade. Moment number two that I want to take you to is in 1954. And I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember what happened in 1954, but there were what was at the time the most famous set of hearings that Congress had ever conducted. They were the so-called Army McCarthy hearings. And they were hearings looking into charges that Joe McCarthy raised in the fall of 1953 that, like the State Department, he said the Army was infested with communists. And he pointed to a specific base in a place called Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, that was the command and control center for not just the Army, but for all the armed services. And McCarthy said that base was again infested with communist moles, that he was going to name names, and he called on then President Eisenhower to do something about it. And at first, the Army tried to coddle McCarthy. They said, yes, Joe, we'll go after all the people that you were named, and they started suspending people at the base. They said, yes, Joe, we will take seriously what you're doing and work with you and your staff to try to figure out just how deep-seated the problems are. And yes, Joe, we will basically kiss your ring because we think that you make sense and we want to be as tough on communism as you are. But over time, it became apparent to the military brass that the more they gave this crusading senator, the more he would demand of them. It also became apparent to them that he was trying to get special treatment for a young staffer named David Shine. McCarthy had as his top aide and his chief of staff a lawyer, a young, arrogant, brilliant lawyer who would go on to become famous or infamous, named Roy Cohn. And Roy Cohn had a young sidekick, a guy that he may or may not have been romantically involved with, but he was sure as heck willing to stick his neck out and try to protect when David Shine was drafted by the Army. So McCarthy and Cohn try to get special treatment for Shine, get him relieved from KP duty, from kitchen patrol that all the other young recruits had to do, get him able to take leaves so he could go around New York and have fun with Roy Cohn, get him out of basically anything onerous with the Army. And the more the Army agreed, the more McCarthy asked for more special treatment. So in the beginning of 1954, the Army finally develops a backbone. And Eisenhower, the president for the previous 14 months, finally develops an ability to say, Joe McCarthy, we're going to stop the apologizing for you. We're going to stop giving you whatever you ask for, and we're going to stand up to you. And in this battle between the Army and McCarthy, the Senate looks at this and the Senate says, we've got to take some charge of this. We've got to do an investigation. So they decide to set up an entire set of hearings looking into who was telling the truth. Was it the Army or was it their colleague, Senator McCarthy? At the beginning of 1954, when the Army is about to launch their investigation, Joe McCarthy is the second most popular political figure in America. A full 1 in every 2 people, a 50% in the Gallup poll, think that Joe McCarthy is doing a great job. And so he starts the Army McCarthy hearings with him looking like the good guy and the Army looking like the ones who are hiding communists and standing up to this heroic Joe McCarthy. And that was the way the public judged what was going on at the start. But during the course of hearings, something extraordinary happened, which was America could see for the first time what Joe McCarthy looked like. And the more they saw him, the more he looked not like a John Wayne heroic character, the more he looked like the town bully. And long before the most famous lines were uttered in that hearing, Joe McCarthy's popularity started to sink. But at one point during the hearing, in what might be the most famous words ever uttered by a lawyer in American history, a savvy lawyer from Boston named Joseph Welch was cross-examining Roy Cohn. And Joe McCarthy interrupted to accuse Welch's young associate of having communist ties. And that was the moment that Welch, who was as good an actor as he was a lawyer, had been waiting for. And he said lines that will ring through American history. He said, Senator, have you no sense of decency? At long last, Senator McCarthy, have you no sense of decency? And that was by then the question that all of America was asking about this bully on their television screen. And I will summarize by saying by August of 1954, when the hearings ended, Joe McCarthy's popularity, which started out at 50%, just 5 months later had sunk to 34%. And the gig was up. Joe McCarthy's Senate colleagues, when they saw finally how unpopular he was becoming, the colleagues who had enabled him, who had been apologists for him, started running away from him. The president that had kept his mouth shut about Joe McCarthy for all this time started running away from him. He had taken on an institution that was too big to bully, the U.S. Armed Services, and he had lost. In December of that year, the Senate decided to censure him. Fully half of every Republican in the Senate, half of the Republicans in the Senate voted to condemn him along with the Democrats, and Joe McCarthy was one of just 6 senators in the history of America who had been censured in that way. And by that time, by December of 1954, his political career was all but over. He stayed on in the US Senate, but just 2 years later, in 1957, Joe McCarthy died a tragic death. And we now know that even though the official coroner's report said he died of acute hepatitis, we can see from his military records that he died of the effects of alcoholism. He had been a heavy drinker before he started tumbling in popularity. He became an out and out alcoholic. After that, he drank himself to death. His fever spiked his last 2 days alive, and he died with delirium tremens, with mumbling all kinds of incomprehensible things, and it was truly tragic. And I think to protect his family, because there was a stigma associated with alcoholism back then, everybody lied about what he died of. The press repeated the lies, and we now know what he really died of. So we've talked about McCarthy at two critical points in his career. 1950, when he launches his crusade, 1954, when it all falls apart for him and he sets himself off on a road to killing himself. And the last moment I would like to take you to is the year 2020. Because while Joe McCarthy died in 1957, McCarthyism, I would argue, is alive and well and breathing firestorm still in Washington these days. And I want to tell you a little bit about what I mean with that. My book is called, it's not called McCarthy, it's called Demagogue. And it's called Demagogue because from the very beginning of American history, we have had a uniquely American strain of demagoguery. We've had bullies with the names of people that you might recollect: Huey Long, a Jew-baiting radio preacher from Michigan named Father Charles Coughlin, a racist senator from Mississippi, I think it was, I'm now blanking, named Theodore Bilbo. We had lots of demagogues before Joe McCarthy. Then McCarthy comes along in 1950, and he writes the playbook and becomes the archetype for all the demagogues who come after. They range from George Wallace to David Duke to a guy who is now our 45th president, who I think uses almost to the letter the McCarthy playbook in a way that is eerie. And I want to read to you two quotes that to me make this case better than anything that I can say. And the first quote is what might have been the singly most famous quote in the 2016 Trump campaign. You might remember that in that campaign, candidate Trump boasted to his supporters that, and I quote, "I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters." Exactly 62 years before that, polling pioneer George Gallup penned a prediction that to me was chillingly similar about Joe McCarthy's supporters. Gallup said, even if it were known that McCarthy had killed 5 innocent children, they would probably still go along with him. And to me, that says that anybody who had been paying attention, and none of us were really paying attention back then, would have seen that Joe McCarthy wasn't just accidentally Donald Trump wasn't accidentally aping Joe McCarthy. It wasn't a coincidence that something was going on there. And the something was, there was a flesh and blood through line from Joe McCarthy to Donald Trump. And that was this young lawyer that we talked about a few minutes ago named Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was Joe McCarthy's protege. Sitting at Joe McCarthy's knee, he learned all the things that Joe McCarthy did to badger his opponents, to use whatever dirty trick he had to pull out of the bag, and to essentially do anything, and I mean anything, to win. Fast forward from 1953 and 54, when Roy Cohn's learning all that from Joe McCarthy, to the 1980s, when Donald Trump is just entering the cutthroat world of New York real estate. And his father, and he realized that he needs somebody to tutor him in how to get along in this new hardball world that he's entering. And they hire a not so young lawyer named Roy Cohn to be Donald Trump's tutor. And Donald Trump's lessons that he was learning from Roy Cohn weren't Cohnisms, they were McCarthyisms. They were the lessons that Cohn had learned half a century before from the ultimate bad guy, the ultimate demagogue and bully, Joe McCarthy. And so I want to just suggest to you a few of the similarities that I see between Trump and McCarthy. With both of them, in lieu of solutions, they point fingers. With both of them, when they're attacked, they would aim a wrecking ball at their assailants. And I think Roy Cohn's motto was, kick them where it hurts and kick them before they can kick you really hard. With both of them, when one charge against a manufactured enemy, and in Joe McCarthy's case, that manufactured enemy was communist spies that didn't exist. And in Donald Trump's case, it is refugees who are pouring across the border in places like Albuquerque and undermining America. When one charge against an enemy like that is exposed as hollow, the next day they lob a fresh bombshell. When the news is bad, bullies like them blame the newsmen. In one case after another, we see things that are going on today reflecting to the letter the blueprint or playbook that was set 70 years ago. And so what I would suggest, and I'm going out on a limb, and some of you can tell me that I'm wrong when we take questions, but I think Donald Trump is a dream come true for those who, for the last 70 years, have been hungering for Joe McCarthy and McCarthyism to come back to life. And I naively thought, before I started writing this book, that all of the story of McCarthy and McCarthyism was a story that was in our past, but we were too sophisticated to buy into that ever again. And so the third moment that I want to take you to and that I want to end with is the fact that we aren't too sophisticated and we show the same vulnerabilities. We buy into really legitimate fears. And the fear of the Soviet Empire in those days was legitimate. The fear of economic dislocation in America is legitimate. What is not legitimate is the simplified solutions that demagogues tell us will solve those real problems. And I think what I would like to do is stop talking. You've heard enough from me, and see if anybody has any questions that they'd like to talk about or discuss.
That would be great. Thank you so much, Larry. This stuff is so fascinating. I'm just perplexed. I just find myself wondering why we're again buying into this demagoguery. What is it culturally, politically that we want to harken back to this since it was so detrimental in the first place? I just don't really understand. I understand the fear factor that you spoke of, but what makes that so strong? What makes characters like Trump so appealing to some people?
So I think that that's a really essential question. That's a question that I've spent the last 3 years looking at. And my only conclusion is that we don't really see full-fledged successful demagogues. Demagogues come along repeatedly, but very few of them have the sticking power and the ability to capture half of America's imagination that Joe McCarthy and Donald Trump did. And there is something in the way they take apart their enemies and the way they convey their message. They are both masters of the media of their time. In Joe McCarthy's case, it was early television and radio, and especially the newspapers. In Donald Trump, it's his tweets, and it's his ability to make, in both of their cases, the press. They start out by charming them, and they make the press into the mouthpiece for their angry message. And there is something about it, and we journalists, I think, bear a whole lot of responsibility.